Good evening, everybody. This is Dan Freiner here with Lambda School. Welcome back to the Lambda School mini bootcamp for our February session. Just a quick overview of what we've done so far. This will be our third lesson. Lesson 1 was on Git and GitHub and version control and how to get all that set up. Lesson 2 last night was an introduction to HTML and CSS. Both of those lessons are up on YouTube, so feel free to go back and review them as you need. If you didn't catch those first 2 lessons, feel free to hang out with us tonight, and then I would suggest going back and watching those 2 so you can get started on your work. Yeah, so welcome back. Tonight we're going to be talking about CSS positioning, and it's a really cool feature of CSS, but it can also be a very daunting feature and catches a lot of developers up. So let me share my screen and we'll get right to it tonight. So yesterday we had talked about a few different HTML elements and the way to give elements classes and IDs. So we can give it an ID, and then we'll say this is PID, and we can say span, oops, and we can give this a class. Kind of a little review of last night, and we can call this span class. And so we know that we can give paragraph elements text, and span elements take text as well. Paragraph elements have a unique feature to them. They will always start on a new line, and span elements, on the other hand, don't always start on a new line. So we know this is a paragraph. This is a span. So we can see that the span, if we had a couple of them in a row, they don't start on new lines, right? They just go one right after the other. Whereas the P, paragraph tag, will always start on a new line. So keep that in mind. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. Another thing that we talked about last night was how to select elements on the page to give styling rules to. So we remember that we can select all of the elements of a certain type just by typing that element's name. And we can give it a new color. So it's going to get all of the paragraph elements on the page and change the color of the text to red. And we can see that it's done that here. And we can use a dot, which signifies that we're going to tell CSS to look for a class. And so we can give it a class of span class. And we'll change the color of that to green. So now it sees we've gone and found all of the spans or all of the elements with the class span class. So that dot tells CSS to look for a class, right? So it's going to go and find all of the elements, which is these 2, with that. And let's show you this too. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same type of element, right? So there's a span and there's a P. They both have the class of span class, and they both got changed to green. So that's how we give our IDs, and that's how we select elements. Oh, also, one last thing. We shouldn't have 2 paragraphs on there with the same ID, but we can just also, instead of just calling the P, we can ask for a specific element with a specific ID and using the hash symbol and then the name of the ID. And that's going to go and grab that element and then apply the rules. Remember, the rules about IDs and classes are that IDs can only be on one element on your page. So IDs are unique to a single element. Classes can be on as many different elements as we want to put them on. And so just keep that in mind. So tonight we're going to talk about positioning. And we're going to talk about how to move elements around the screen and how to get them to do what we want them to do. Building a layout, a UI layout, and making everything look clean and good is what most people are looking to do when they start learning CSS. Positioning HTML elements on the page with CSS is one of the most powerful abilities of CSS. It really lets us move things around and get it looking exactly the way we want. Like I said, though, it can be one of the most frustrating. So keep that in mind when you're learning this, that this is not something that comes easy. This is something that comes after a lot of use. And the goal of essentially a lot of this class is just to get you introduced to these concepts. You can start playing around with them. Go on something like CodePen or all the assignments we have and just start playing around with things and start messing around with them and learning how they work. So this is just an introduction to these concepts. By no means are you expected to master these concepts by the end of the class. So we're going to talk today about a few different things. We're going to give you an introduction to the display property, which is one of the first most important steps in positioning elements with CSS. We're then going to talk about the position property. And then we're going to use the position property to position elements on the screen. Finally, tonight we are going to talk about Flexbox and give you a quick introduction to Flexbox, which is kind of the new standard for positioning using CSS. So let's talk about the display property first. Every HTML element has a built-in default display property. There are two types of display properties. There is the block and there is an inline element. So there are block and inline elements. We'll start with block right now. The rule of thumb, a block element is always going to start on a new line, and it's always going to take up the maximum width of the container it's in. So as we're looking at our screen right now, we can kind of see that which one of these two elements, we'll remove that P, is the one that starts on a new line every time. We know that P does, right? That's one of the main properties of the paragraph element, is that it starts on a new line every time. So we can kind of infer there that P is a block element. So the two things a block element needs to do: always start at a new line and always take up the maximum width of the container that it's in. So we already have access to it here. So let's just give this a border and let's find out. Right. There we go. Now we can see that paragraph here, even though there's only that much text in it, it's still taking up the entire container. It's still taking up the entire width of the container. And if this was in a smaller container, it would take up as much room as it possibly can. That is a fundamental feature of a block element. The other type of block element is an inline element. And an inline is kind of the opposite of a block element. So an inline is not going to start on a new line, and it's only going to take up the width that we need to display the data that it's given. So let's see what we got. We have another element on the screen that kind of fits that. And we see here that the span, we put a border around it, is only taking up the amount of space that it needs to display the data that we've given it. We can see the data this is a span, right? And so we can say that the paragraph element is a block element and the span is an inline element. Now, every single element in HTML is either a block or a span. And it's up to us to kind of, through practice and through working with this so much, to really learn to recognize which are which. That is going to take a lot of work and a lot of practice. But there's always the documentation. There's a link to the HTML documentation at the end of this, the README for this lesson. And you can go back into it if you're building an HTML page and you are wondering what type of display element property that element has, you can either, I like to just wrap it in a border and you can see right then and there, or you can go look at the documentation as well and find out what type it is. But just know that there are two types and know how they differentiate from each other. So those are the two default types of display elements. In CSS, we have the ability to alter those default types. So if we know that this p tag is a block, we can use the display property and change it to inline. And now we see that that p tag has changed from a block level from a block element to an inline element. See, it's only taking up the amount of space it needs to display the data that we've given it, and it's not starting on a new line, right? And we can move that down one to kind of show you that it'll not start at a new line. But if we remove that display, it will start on a new line. So it's a block here, and it's an inline element there. We can do the opposite as well. We can take a inline element and create a block element out of it. So now it takes up the entire width of the container it's in, and it will start on a new line every single time. There are a few other display properties that we can set on an element. We're going to go over one more of them today, which is flex. There's also something called an inline block. There is something called flex, which we'll talk about a little bit later. There is a grid, which is the new CSS grid functionality. We won't be getting into that in this course, but you will talk about it in the full-time course if you choose to apply for that. And then there's also display of none. And display of none actually removes the element completely off the page. You might be thinking to yourself, why would I ever want to put a display of none on an element? Obviously, I've written it onto the page. I want it to be there. But we're going to see that in action more when we start bringing JavaScript in to manipulate things on the page. You know, say if you had an item that if you clicked it, you wanted it to disappear, then you would put display none on it. Also note that there are two ways to make elements disappear. There's display none, as we see here. And there's also a visibility hidden. And we can see that when we put visibility hidden on an element, that the element disappears, but where the element should normally be is still there. It still takes up the space. So we can just say that we've made this element invisible, but it's still there. When we put display none on an element, we remove the element from the page. So those are the big difference between display none and visibility hidden. Display none actually removes the element, and visibility hidden just makes the element invisible, essentially. So yeah, those are the display properties and how we can affect items with the display. The next thing we're going to go into is the position property. And the position property is where things start to get a little bit more confusing. So I'm going to set up a couple of things here real quick for us. I'm going to remove all this. We're going to talk about div, parent, div, child. And then we're going to put P in here and say child. P here and say parent. Okay, I'm going to give the parent, so I actually wanted to make that an ID on that, so let's make that an ID and that one an ID as well. So we're going to select the ID of parent. And I want to give it a height and width and some color to it. So let's go height 300 px, width 300 px, and then let's go background color blue. So that's not just orange, a little bit better. And so then same thing with our child. I'm going to select the ID, see it's the hash symbol of child, and I'm going to give it a height 100, width of 100, and a background color of green. Should be nice and ugly for the screen for us. So we have a parent, which is this div, and we have a child, which is this div. So the parent is the top level component, and actually it has two children. It has this P, but this child is what we're really interested in right now. So let's talk about the position property. So the position property is going to specify the type of positioning method used for the element itself. There are 5 methods available. We're going to go over 4 of them today. So the first method we're going to talk about is position of static. And when you set something to position of static, you will see that nothing happened on the screen. And that's because position of static is the default position for every single HTML element. All position of static is doing is telling the element, act like you normally would. So it's not affecting it in any way. And in fact, we are, especially in this mini boot camp, we're never going to set position of static on an element. You know, like what I said with the display if none, setting position of static on something using JavaScript in the future might be something we could think about, but for the most part, we don't set the position of anything to static. So just keep that in mind that you're never going to set this to static, but it's what every single element on the page is preset to. So that's our first one. Our second is relative. And relative, as you can see, also didn't do anything, but relative did do something behind the scenes. Relative is now kind of allowing our parent container here to be moved, and all of its children will be moved relative to its position. So if we want to move it over to the right, we can do that. If we want to move it down, we can do that, and the child will stay exactly where it is in the container. That's what it refers to as relative. Relative opens up a few positioning methods for us. So we have top, bottom, left, and right. And so when we set it to relative, what we're doing is now creating a grid on our page here, where the top is the uppermost part of our page, the leftmost, bottom is the bottom, right is the right. And these are all start at 0 here. So if we want to move the item down, we can set it to a distance from the top. And so it starts at 0. So 0 is where it's currently at. And let's set it down 50 pixels. And now we can see it's moved away from the top by 50 pixels. Know that whatever you set, it's going to move away from that axis by that amount. So then we can say left of 50 pixels. And we can see that it's moved 50 pixels down away from the top and 50 pixels to the right away from the left. This is only available if you have a position other than static. If you have static, it doesn't work. If you have relative, it does work. Or the other two that we're going to talk about soon. So this allows us to move items around. let's talk about the child real quick. If we set this to position of relative, and this to top of 60 pixels, we can see that it moves 60 pixels away from its parent container, from the top of it, not 60 pixels away from the top of the screen. So it moves relative to its parent as well. And we can go left 100 pixels. So you can see how that's affecting that. So the child is being, every child is being affected by its parent container when we talk about relative. Let's talk about the next item, which is absolute. And so absolute is going to essentially move the child in a way absolute to the nearest container that it's in. So let's go top 0. So since this parent container is not in any sort of position, so it needs to be a position of relative, absolute, or fixed, then the child is going to find the nearest container, and in this case, it's the viewport, which is what we call the screen. And so we can move it absolute to, let's move it to 600 px. Down there. So it's going to move absolute to the screen. And it's going to, yep. But if we have it on inside of a container that is not, there we go. Now we can see that 0 is the top of the parent container here. So the child can be moved from the top or from the inside of this container. So let's go 200. Nope, that's 2000. That's too much. So now it's all the way at the bottom. And so now we can move the child around the parent container. And let's see what we do. Overflow. That's what I'm looking for. Scroll. Okay. It'll stay at that one position in the container. Okay. The last and final position property we'll talk about today is called fixed. Now let's remove that. And let's, instead of changing that to absolute, let's change that to fixed. So what fixed is doing is it's pulling the element outside of its containers and it's putting it at a spot that's fixed to the viewport. So if we do 0, oh, this is it, 0. So it's outside of the container now. So let's go in this and go back with that. We need to do it even more. Now we see that no matter how much we scroll, that child is always going to be at that fixed position on the viewport. And this can be 20, left 400. And we can put it in an exact spot we want, and it'll stay at that exact spot. So this is really most useful for things like creating menu bars on websites or headers, or just things that you don't want ever moving off of the screen. It's always going to stay in a fixed position on the screen itself. And so those are our 4 position types. Static, which is what every element is given as a default position. There's relative, which allows the container to move and all of its children to move relative to its place. There's absolute, which allows a container or child to move within a parent container in a absolute way. And then there's fixed, which affixes the element to the viewport, to the screen itself. So those are the 4 main position properties. So let's get rid of this stuff. And I'm actually going to bring over a new screen here. So we're going to talk about Flexbox now. Flexbox has been around for about 8 years, but it's finally gained pretty good acceptance within all browsers now. So we can start using it on everything except for Internet Explorer and prior to that. It's a really exciting feature because it allows us to position our elements in relation to the parent and to each of the other elements. No longer do we have to apply these like CSS hacks for things like centering and evenly dividing elements in a container. This allows for us to develop for mobile-friendly design. We call it responsive design. You know, we have no longer do we have all the same computer monitors, but now we have, you know, everything from a 47-inch curved monitor to a tiny iPhone SE. And so we need to be able to create content for all of those using the same the code we're writing. And so to do that, Flexbox really helps out quite a bit. It's pretty complicated pretty quick, and it's definitely something you'll need to play with quite a bit. But when you take the time and you really get used to it, it makes layout and makes positioning things on your screen really, really quick and easy. Couple of things that we should talk about when we talk about Flexbox is that Flex is always going to be on a container. The container itself is going to be the Flexbox, and it is given an axis. We call it the main axis. And the axis is either going to be pointing down or left to right. So it's going to be left to right, up to down. There's also down to up and right to left. Right now, we don't have a Flexbox. This is just a parent div with 4 children div in it. So to kind of go over what we're just going to talk about, let's go display and turn that to flex. And we'll see, let's give those a little bit of padding or margin. I will give it a border. All right, now we see that our elements are going from left to right, so that we know that when we give a parent container, so this red container here is the parent that has the display of flex on it. When we give that container the display of flex, our axis, our main axis is going from left to right, and we call that the row. We call that a row axis. So from left to right is how all of our content is going to work. And so we know that that's our axis. If we can change that, it automatically is set to row. We can change that to column, and it will go from flex direction column. You gotta spell it right. And it'll go from top to bottom. All right, so that's our main axis is from top to bottom. But just to make things less confusing, it automatically defaults to row, which is from left to right. So now we can start positioning these elements on that axis as we want. And mind you that all of the CSS we're going to talk about with Flexbox is going to go on the parent, the main parent container. There's only one item that's going to go on the child, and that'll be at the very end. But all of the CSS we're going to talk about is going to go on the parent container here. So we now have access to a few other CSS properties now that we have display flex. We have justify content, which is going to act on the main axis we have, right? So it goes left to right. So justify content is going to work on left to right. And we have line items, which is going to work on the opposite axis. It's going to work on the up to down, right? So since our main axis is left to right, align items is going to work the exact opposite, which will be up to down. So, and actually, let's give this parent a little bit more. Let's just say, give it a height and a width. 100. Let's make that 3, so make that a little bit more visible to us. Okay, so now we have our parent container. So what is in red is our parent container. Our axis is going from left to right, and that's our justify content. So we can now start positioning these items the way we would like them to. So right now they are positioned as flex start. So flex to start just means where they would start. It's the default starting area from what you want. We also have access to flex end, which will now move all of the items to the very end of the axis. All right, so we're on the left to right axis. The start is the left, the right is the end. And so it's moved all of the items over to the end. We also have center, which will center all of our items on the axis, on the main axis. And so we have just centered all of these items perfectly on this axis. And let's, I'll show you why this is so cool. Let's go 75%. So we can see that this box is, I set it to 75%, so it's going to change with the size of the window here. But no matter what, those items are always going to stay in the very center. Okay, that's why it's so cool. And that's, you know, something that was not very available to us in the past. And let's move on, and I'll show you even cooler stuff with Flexbox. So flex start, flex end, and center, they're all fantastic. They all have their place. But most of the time when we're creating layouts, we want to space items apart equally. We want to make sure that the margins are exact. And before, we had to use a lot of math. We had to calculate the size of the container. We had to calculate the size of the children, and then we had to figure out exactly how much margin to put on each of them in order to get them exactly as far apart as we wanted them. You know, that only worked on one size container. You know, if we wanted something that, you know, would work in changing the size of the screen, we'd have to write lots and lots of media queries and code like that. But Flexbox made that pretty simple for us. We have two properties or two methods we can use. First is called space between, and that's going to spread out the items with the first item being on flex start and the last item being on flex end, and then it's going to put equal space in between all of those items. So we can now see that is calculated automatically for us. And we don't have to do those manual calculations anymore. We don't have to create different code for different size screens for this sizing, the spacing like this anymore. It automatically is going to do that for us. So space between goes from flex start to flex end. All right. What if we want to have margins, equal margins on both sides all the way across the axis? Then we can use space around. And space around is going to give us equal margins on both sides of all of the elements, all the child elements. Okay, so there will be, and that is still automatically done as well. So now that we can space our items out exactly how we want them along the main axis, let's talk about the opposite axis when we use align items. When we use align items, we can use flex start, flex end, and center for it. So let's say, we are currently at flex start. We want to move the items to flex end. There we go. So now we're working on the opposite axis, right? Our main axis went from left to right, and our opposite axis now is going from top to bottom. So flex end, and we have center on it as well. So now we can move the elements out around exactly the way we want. And so we've centered them, and we've added equal space all around them. So let's start talking about justify content and align items with a different direction. So if we change the direction, right, we change the main axis. So we can think of this as main axis direction. Okay, so this is just, flex direction is just saying how we want to affect the main axis. And in this case, we want to make it into a column. So we want it to go from top to bottom, right? And remember, row is the other that goes from left to right, and that's row is our default. But if we want to change it, we can go column, top to bottom. Now, justify content is always going to affect the main axis. Justify content, just don't put it in your head that justify content affects things left to right. Justify content affects the main axis always. And in this case, the main axis is going from top to bottom because we've changed it, right? And just kind of want to reiterate that over and over again. If we have it at row, which is what it defaults to, justify content affects the main axis from left to right. If we have it on column, it goes top to bottom. And we can even go one step further with this. We can talk about, we can actually reverse the order of the elements and reverse the axis. So if we wanted, instead of going top to bottom, wanted to go bottom to top, we say column, reverse. And now we can see that the elements start at the bottom and go to the top. And we can now see that flex start is the bottom because that's the start of the axis, right? So when we say column reverse, we talk about column, which is up and down, and reverse is bottom to top, okay? We can do the same with row and have row reverse. So now we are going from right to left on row. So the reverse of the row, remember row starts from left to right, and it's our default, but reverse goes from right to left. And so that's how you can change the direction, and that's how you can affect it using justify content. And then we can, if that was column, and let's do a space around. And now we can talk about align items here. So since justify content is only affecting the main axis, and the main axis right now is column reverse, which means bottom to top, then align items is going from left to right. Let's go. So there's align items. So since it's column, it doesn't really matter that we've had reverse on here for the align items. Align items on a column is going to go left to right. Line items on a row is going to go top to bottom. And then we can say flex end, and center, just like we have for all of align items. So that's the main point of Flexbox, is that you have a container, you have a main axis, which I'll just throw that back to row. You have a main axis, which in this case is going from left to right, which is what it defaults to. And then you have justify content, which affects the items along that main axis. So space around, space between, flex start, flex end, center. Goes from left to right on row. And then align items is either going to go top to bottom or left to right. It's going to affect the secondary axis. And if we have row, then the secondary axis, since the main axis is going left to right, the secondary axis is going to go top to bottom. And then we can set center, flex start, or flex end on align items. So the last item I'm going to talk about with Flexbox tonight is the only one that gets set on the child element of the ones we're going to talk about. All of these items, remember, are set on the parent container. They're all set on the parent to affect its children. Okay, the only one that will actually set on the individual child, let's give this one class, another class, and we'll say 1. It's something called align self. The align self is going to allow you to break out of the align items and set something else on it. All right, so it allows that one single individual item to break out of the align items rules, and allows you to do something else. So let's say flex end. So now we have broken that one out. It's still on the axis, on the main axis, right? Justify content, it goes left to right. There's still the same amount of space and there, but now we've broken it out of the align items. And so we can set it to whatever, flex space, flex start. We can set it whatever we want. So if we have these align items at flex start, and we wanted this one, only this one to be centered, that's how we would do it. So that's kind of the basic primer to Flexbox. There is a lot more to it, and I would definitely suggest there are some resources in the README of this lesson that you go through them. I think that my favorite Flexbox tutorial on the internet is something called Flexbox Froggy, and it just requires you to write the correct Flexbox properties to move the frogs onto their respective lily pads. So we're going to go justify content center. It's a really, really great resource to go through Flexbox. And there are a number of resources that are included at the end of the README for tonight's lesson. And I'd suggest going through those and then working on the lesson tonight. Like I said, CSS positioning is not a simple undertaking. This is just the very tip of it. And even then it starts to get a little confusing. So take your time, and CSS, it all takes practice to just being able to understand what properties work the way that you want them to. That being said, that's it for tonight's lesson. I'll open it up to questions, see if we have any. Let's see. Are you able to split the windows like that in Visual Studio Code? You are. There's a shortcut. I believe it's Command Shift and the number. You have to look it up. Look up the split window shortcut for VS Code. There is a way to do this though. But remember, this is all on CodePen. And so, we had some talk last night about, what's the difference between this and VS Code? Well, this is just for playing around. you can export it, I guess. But when you really want to save files and you're really building a project, you want to do that in your text editor. And that allows you to have access to all the files and really allows you to build out a project. So just once again, I'm just showing you this because we get instant feedback over here with CodePen. But all of our projects and all of our work is to be done in Visuals or in your text editor. Flexbox is popular right now. How does it compare to CSS Grid, which is preferred? CSS Grid is not fully implemented on all browsers yet. CSS Grid is awesome, and it actually gives you even more power than Flexbox does. That being said, it's really up to you, and it's up to when you get into the professional world. Whatever your company uses is what you're going to end up using, and Flexbox just has a lot more availability as far as browser support goes at the moment. CSS Grid is amazing, and if you are great at Flexbox and you want to go further, there is a CSS Grid resource on the README, and there's also Flexbox Froggy. The people that made one called Grid Garden, I believe, which does the same exact thing but for CSS Grid. Any questions you have, please post them in the questions channel on Slack, and I will get to them. I'll give you a couple more minutes. There's a question about Bootstrap on here. So Bootstrap is a UI library, and Bootstrap, what they're doing is writing all of this underneath for you. So Bootstrap is definitely something that is viable, but they have their own set styles. And so Bootstrap is really great for prototyping projects, really great for, if you don't have a designer and you just want to build something real quick, you can use Bootstrap. But essentially Bootstrap has written all of the CSS. All of their stuff is just CSS that you're importing into your file. And it does, you can use it for grids and sizing and all that as well. Okay, well, that's going to cover it for tonight. The lesson for tonight was CSS Positioning, Lesson 3. There is an assignment. And actually, let me, you'll open it up in, let's go find it real quick. So this is going to be, you're going to have open up, and you're going to have homework CSS.css. And this is where you're writing all of your CSS. There is also homework.html, which you won't write anything in homework HTML. You will not need to change anything in this file. Make sure your work is in homework CSS. What you're going to do is open up homework.html in a browser, or if you have a text editor with live preview, you can do that as well. So open up pre-course, positioning, homework.html. And you're going to see that there are instructions on ways to move items around on this page, to get things to disappear, to move that tiger into that red dotted box, to create this as a header bar up at top. So there's a lot to do in here. And there are 7 exercises. And then there's also that grid guide at the very end of that too. All right, guys. Well, thanks a lot for joining in for Lesson 3. Lesson 4 is tomorrow night, and we are going to jump into JavaScript land. So tomorrow's going to be an introduction to JavaScript. Thanks a lot once again for joining me in Lambda School here for this mini boot camp. And we will See you later. Have a great night, and we'll see you tomorrow.